If you use UiPath Studio, I have 5 tips that will instantly improve your code readability and variable management so that you and your team can collaborate on the robots much better and they'll perform much better. So let's get started. Hey, I'm Ash and welcome to another video on RPA. Today we are talking about UiPath variable management tips. And why are we talking about variable management tips on a channel that is for beginners? I'm glad you asked. As I've already said in some of my other videos, whether you are an RPA professional or someone who's just starting to explore what RPA is all about and trying to learn and understand the technology, no matter your current stage in your RPA journey, variable management and naming conventions is something that we can all learn and we should all implement in our code because they are a lifesaver. No, really, I mean it. They save lives. So, without any further delay, let's get into it. Your code becomes much easier to understand when a consistent naming convention is followed. Make sure your variables are named something relevant to what they are doing in the sequence or the workflow where you're using them, and not something like ABC, PQR, or XYZ. And that wasn't even our first tip. Consider that a freebie. Now, let's get into the first one. Number 1, use camel case. What is camel case? Camel case is a commonly followed naming convention in several programming languages in which we declare longer variable names that are more relevant to the process, more relevant to the piece of code that we're writing in. And if they have multiple words in them, we combine them, making it a single word, but still have it make sense by capitalizing the first letters of each variable name. For example, I have this variable called my first unicorn. I am capitalizing the letters M, F, and U, which makes it easy for me to read if I am reading someone else's code, or if someone else is reading my code, they'll immediately understand what I'm saying. Sometimes it could be confusing if your variable name just has all small cases or all capitals, and then it becomes difficult to understand what that word is. So this is one way you can make it easier for everyone to read your code. Some people prefer to use underscores in their names, and that's also a wonderful way to declare variables. But using camel case in your variables is a widely used technique, and it makes your code very easy to read. Second, case sensitivity. Now, I touched upon case sensitivity just briefly in my previous point. That is, you could use capital letters in your variable names. However, in .NET or in UiPath Studio specifically, case sensitivity isn't a stringent concept. You could declare your variable like this. However, when you're using it or calling it in your code, you could choose to use it with all smalls or all capitals. The compiler will not complain. However, in the interest of keeping your code consistent and again easily readable, it is recommended that you use the variables just like they are declared in your original declaration. And the easiest way to do that is whenever you're about to use a variable, you just use the control space keyboard shortcut, and that brings up a list of all the variables available to you, and you can choose that so it follows the exact case format. Moving on, number 3. This is a don't. Do not use keywords or class names as your variable names. An easy example of this is file. When we are dealing with multiple files, let's say I want to get a list of all the Excel files that are present in a certain directory, or if I want to get a list of all the files in a certain folder, I could use certain method that will give me all the names, and then because it's a file, I can use the system.io.file class to open it. However, if I were opening a file, sometimes it's easier to just call it file is equal to new file, and then that can confuse the compiler sometimes whether we are talking about a class or a variable. It probably won't fail your program, but it's recommended that you use something that's not a keyword. So you could say file, my file. Number 4, use data type prefixes for your variable declarations. Now, this is a tip where you can standardize but also customize or personalize your variable names to your liking. For example, if you have multiple string variables, you can declare them all starting with str, or you could call them something else. For example, string, the whole word, or str, or just s, for example. And when you do that, all your variables will be grouped or will be easy to find. If you have a lot of variables, and it's obviously sometimes difficult to keep track of every variable that you have declared, and pressing S or pressing str will automatically shortlist all the variables for you when you're trying to get the relevant variable you need while programming. Now, of course, if you go to the variable panel, because UiPath Studio is a graphical interface, obviously you can sort your variable names with the data type, and then obviously it'll group all the string variables together. You can easily find the variable you're looking for, but it's easier to remember what prefix you have used and then just bring up shortlist that list by simply pressing the first three letters of the variable, and that way you can find them. Personally, I use str for my string variables, I use dt for my data tables, and so on and so forth. You could have int for integers. Some people even do an arr for arrays, or lst or list for all your lists. You can customize it to however you want. If you want to come up with a common terminology within your team, you can do that. Sit down, maybe spend like 15 minutes and just get together, decide that this is how you're going to do it. That's a very good way to collaborate on common projects. Number 5, arguments. This one is my favorite. Arguments are slightly different to variable names in that they are not used within the workflow, but they're actually arguments that we are passing on to another workflow when we invoke another file or another piece of code that is somewhere else outside our current file. Arguments can have any data type, just like any variable, but the additional property that exists for arguments is that they have a direction. They can be going in, they could be coming out, or they could be in out, which is a way of saying we could pass a value in but also get it back with an updated value. So using the same variable, we can have it two ways, or just going in or coming out. That's just a quick refresher on what arguments are. Now, the problem that several developers, including myself, have faced a lot of times is that when we create an argument, by default it has the direction in, so which means we are only passing the value in, we're not getting anything out. More often than not, whenever you invoke a workflow, you would expect something in return, because typically workflows would be called for something like do this calculation but do it outside, because that may be some piece of code that you use frequently, so you could call it from multiple places and it'll just return you one answer. Now, there are two things about arguments that are really important. One, we've already covered the direction. You know what in out and in/out means. Now, UiPath already have a coding best practice recommendation, that is, when you declare a variable that is of direction in, you start it with in underscore and then you can call it anything. So again, this fits in with the number 4, which is if you wanted to pass a string variable inward, you could have it say in underscore str and then the rest of your variable name, whatever that may be. So it could be something like in underscore str unicorn name. Now that name, we can see that it's going in, it's of type string without even looking at any of the properties in the arguments panel or variables panel. That is the beauty of this naming convention. You don't have to check, you just know. However, that brings me to my next point within arguments, which is you could call an argument in underscore or out underscore based on the direction you want it to take. However, you still need to remember to change the direction. That definitely is outside the variable management technique, but obviously it's something that must be said in this context, because you should call your arguments with in underscore for going in, out underscore for going or coming out, and IO, which is again UiPath's own recommendation for declaring in-out variables. And IO underscore, your variable name, is something that you can pass in with a value, get it updated with your program, and still get it back when your workflow has finished execution. Remember to change the direction of your variables. That is the one important takeaway from number 5, which is argument. These are the 5 quick tips that hopefully help you build better code and write more readable code so that you and your teammates are happy and always have a consistent naming convention that you don't have to memorize because you know it by heart, because you built it, you designed it. If you found these tips helpful, I'll ask you to forward it to just 3 friends who might also benefit from this. And if you like the video, please like and subscribe so that you can get updates about my next videos. I'll see you in my next video. Happy automation.